A very good evening, everyone. Before we start, may I request all to put your hands on your heart for the ICI motto, please.
Volume, Mishra ji. Sudesh Jagrati. Sudesh Kam Kam Purushu.
So, friends, today we start off with a very, unique program. I think till now we've always had our analysis of the finance bill. Today we have analysis of also the finance amendment bill. But before we start, may I recognize the presence of Shri Gautam Doshi, our speaker for the day, a very eminent personality in the field of direct taxes. We'll soon be joined by our president, sir. We have our chairman, WRC, CM Manish Gadia, my regional council colleague and treasurer, WRC for the year 21-22, CA Jayesh Kala with me. I would say that it's really my privilege to, address on this occasion. As we know that the finance bill was tabled on February 1, 2021, and after that there were quite a few analysis and sessions that we had at various forums. Today we have the finance bill which has been passed by both the houses but with amendments, and there are quite a few amendments which have come about, and that's why there was a need to have another session to analyze the amendments which are proposed. And we are so privileged that today Gautam Doshi sir agreed at such a short notice to address and give his analysis on the amendments which have come about. And now, may I request our chairman, WRC, Manish Gadia sir, to share his thoughts. Manish bhai, over to you, please.
Thank you, Rushri Madam. First of all, I congratulate you to organize this program at such a short notice. So we were just discussing before the program, there were 67 amendments which has been made between bill to act. So very significant amendment. As Dusri Madam has rightly said that's why we have kept this meeting. Few of them is that Provident Fund bill. It was proposed that if you are contributing more than 2.5 lakh, then about 2.5 lakh, whatever interest will be there, that will be taxable. Now that limit is increased 2.5 lakh to 5 lakh. Tax audit also, they have clarified that cash will also include bearer instrument. So again, in the limit of that 5% for 1 to 10 crore. And then again, just want to inform all the members that you should keep in mind that ATG certificate need to be renewed by all the trusts with effect from 1st April 2021. So this you should do it immediately. And as far as tax audit is concerned, now GST detail and GAR detail also has been deferred, as they have deferred last year. Same way they have deferred this year also. So I will not take much of your time since we have Gautam Bhai with us. So we will eager to listen him. Over to you, Rushni Madam. And before that, I wish all of you in advance happy Holi. Play safe and healthy Holi this year. Over to you, Rushni Madam.
Thank you, Manish Bhai, for a very crisp and effective address. Now, may I request my regional council colleague and treasurer, CA Jayesh Kala, to introduce the speaker for the evening. Of course, he doesn't need any introduction. Everybody knows Gautam Bhai, but we would like to do a formal introduction. Jayesh Bhai, over to you, please.
Privilege to introduce a personality like Gautam Bhai. Gautam Bhai Doshi, a chartered accountant and masters in commerce, has been in professional practice for over 40 years. He advises various industrial groups and families and also serves as director on various leading public listed and unlisted companies. Mr. Doshi has more than 40 years of experience in wide range of areas covering mergers and acquisition, direct, indirect, and international taxation, transfer pricing, accounting, and corporate and commercial laws. He has been actively involved in conceptualizing and implementing a number of mergers and restructuring transactions, both domestic and cross-border, involving many of the top 20 listed companies on the BSE and also those forming part of FTSE 100. A prolific speaker, Mr. Doshi has addressed several seminars and conferences within and outside of India and courses organized by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, International Fiscal Association, other professional bodies, and Chamber of Commerce. He has served on the Council of Western Region as also all India level of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, which has the task of development and regulation of profession of accountancy in India. During his tenure on the council, he served on several committees and contributed significantly to the work of Board of Studies, which is responsible for education and system of training of students. He also served as chairman of committees on direct and indirect taxation. So with this brief background, I can say that we have an apt speaker. This is in fact in continuation with what we have deliberated on 4th of February regarding the analysis on the finance bill. As Rushiben has told that the amendments are huge, so we have invited him for analysis on amendments of finance bill. Over to you, Rushiben.
Thank you, Jayesh Bhai, for this introduction. And I know that a personality like Gautam Bhai cannot be summed up in words in such a short introduction. People who know him and who have worked with him would understand what I mean by this. But Gautam Bhai, may I just take this liberty to just request you if President Sir can address. He has joined just now. And may I request if President Sir could address just now, and then we can start off with the session, sir.
Great, Trustee.
Yeah. So
we to listen to him.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we are really privileged today that we have with us our President Sir also with us, and he actually was traveling, and because of his hectic schedule, he was not able to join in time. But now I think he has been able to join. He's just landed and he's been able to join just now. And he's also a prolific speaker, and he's known for his direct tax analysis post budget. So may I request if President Sir could also address the gathering with his insights and words of wisdom.
Yeah, thank you, Drusti. Chairman WIRC, Manish, Vice Chairperson Drusti, uh, Secretary Arpit, Treasurer Jayesh Kala, uh, today's very learned speaker and the one to whom we long to listen. And whenever he is there, you are tempted to listen for the full session. Unfortunately, after taking this position, it becomes so difficult to continue for the whole session. And young Abhitan, who is also there, uh, I may only say, because I would like listeners to have complete benefit of Gautam Bhai's presence and this analysis. I understand that this session particularly has been organized to discuss the changes between the bill and the act, and there were around 100 changes in the act proposed by the bill, and thereafter about more than 20 uh, uh, amendments or additions or clarifications are there between the bill and the act. And it would be very interesting for the participants to know what are the implications. Fortunately, what we see is there are some clarifications which are there in the amendments which are made post the bill, like in goodwill, that how the WDV of the goodwill will be calculated to take it out of the block. There is complete clarity, like treating it as a standalone asset and do it. Even in reconstitution of firm, there were several ambiguities which are sought to be clarified, and there are many others which I would not like to deal with because there is an expert, and when there is Bansi Bhai or Gautam Bhai, I have seen to it that I attend the full session and take complete benefit of their deliberations and analysis. Uh, the only point is probably Gautam Bhai may guide us that much before they start preparing for budget, probably there are many amendments which are required in the law to address some of the recent issues, like when they buy out, and many companies may have to undergo restructuring in the form of merger demerger, solely to see that in the group they optimize the payment. If they introduce taxation scheme in India, or if they introduce carry backward of losses, which is available in many other countries of the world. Of course, we tried this once or twice with the CBDT and the finance ministry. Their minds at that time were closed. But if some of these provisions can be introduced, and we can suggest and impress upon them that they are ultimately finally in the interest of the country, and they would bring in much required ease of doing, then it would be better. And probably before the next budget, we may even like to seek your advice on what should be the very dynamic amendments which we should seek from the government, and that would bring in much ease for the business community, and they would be able to do restructuring without doing much like merger, demerger, and many things which we are required to do. The lengthy processes that we are required to follow today. And when we do that, even at that stage, we are not sure whether it will be covered by GAR or not covered by GAR, and we have to test it fully before we implement any scheme now. So these were some of the remarks, and I think Gautam Bhai will guide us as to what should be our course of action when we present pre-budget memorandum on behalf of the institute and many other organizations, so that much clarity and much ease is brought into the tax law. With this, I would again leave it to the organizers and leave it for Gautam Bhai for enough time to guide the participants sufficiently on amendments which have taken place. Thank you so much for inviting me. Uh, and share my views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nihal Bhai, for making it possible to join this gathering. It's really a privilege that you could join and you could address the gathering. Now, may I request our faculty for the evening, CA Gautam Doshi, to start the session and enlighten us on the amendments which have come about. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Trustee Manish, Jayesh, and Nihal Bhai. Thanks for the words of introduction and your very kind words on the bill and the future of the tax laws. And thanks to WRC for organizing this interesting event to discuss the amendments to the finance bill. It's a rare thing, as Drashti said, but then we have really had so many amendments this time that we had no choice but to really discuss them and perhaps try to understand what they are trying to say. Now, what you have a variety of subjects which are covered by the amendments, just as much as the finance bill covered a variety of subjects. We have, of course, over the years always been asking that all such amendments should preferably come through an amendment act, in which case we would not be facing the same amount of difficulty as we are facing today. We would have time to represent, some select committee of parliament would look at it, and you would have amendments which are well considered. But while that is something which only may happen in the years to come, today we have the finance bill, and the system is that the finance bill brings in all the amendments. And in this case, not only did the finance bill make a number of amendments, those amendments have been improved by the Finance Act. Both the houses have already passed it. We are only waiting for the assent of the President. Turning to the major issues which seem to have been covered by the amendments between the bill and the act, one of the key ones relates to slump sale. Some of the key subjects I thought I would deal with at length. Three subjects in particular: those dealing with slump sale, goodwill, and the partnerships. And then I will try to deal with the other subjects where changes have been made, but they are not of the same magnitude. The first major subject which requires our attention is that relating to slump sales. Now, this was an area where the major change in the finance bill was that the law on slump sale was extended to include slump exchanges. That was, in a sense, a welcome change. Welcome because a loophole in the law was being plugged. It was a loophole. If a sale for money is taxable, there is no reason why an exchange where instead of money you get shares or debentures should not be taxable. So that was made taxable by the finance bill. What the Finance Act now seeks to do is slightly different. What it is doing is, it is now trying to change the mode by which the profit from the sale, whether it is for money or whether it is for shares and debentures, whether it is a slump sale or a slump exchange, would be arrived at. So what we are concerned is with the transfer of an undertaking, and how would the profit on the transfer of the undertaking be computed. This, unfortunately, if I may use that word, is coming in with effect from April 1, 2020. While the change is welcome, slump exchange should be taxed. I'm not sure we need a formula for computing profits, but if the CBDT or the government feel that a formula is required to compute profits, that's also fine. That's welcome. But one would have liked that the law is amended with notice so that this was to come into effect and impact all transactions after April 1, 21 rather than transactions from April 1, 20. After all, one should know the law on the day when one is putting through the transaction. If on that day the law was different and suddenly it becomes taxable and taxable by a formula which is now laid down in the Act, then that adds to the complexity of doing business and may involve an unexpected tax liability which business is not prepared for. If business was aware of this tax liability, business would have taken a different stand. A number of internal restructuring transactions may not have been done by the slump sale route if one knew how slump sales are going to be taxed. Now, even today, we don't know that. What we know is that a formula is to be laid down to determine the fair value of the undertaking. The cost formula is already there in the Act, and the profit would then be the difference between the consideration, which is the fair value, which will be determined as per prescribed rules, and the cost. The difficulty is the rules are to be prescribed, and naturally they can only be prescribed, they can only come out after the Act becomes an Act. So till then we don't know the rules. And till we know the rules, we would not know how the fair value is to be determined. The possibility is that the rule will have either a concept similar to 11 UA or DCF, which is also there in 11 UA in the context of 5627B. So one of those two rules will come in. One doesn't know which rule is going to come in. If it is an 11 UA type of rule, what it will say is revalue the land, the shares, the securities, and certain other assets of the undertaking. And if those assets are revalued, the rest of the assets can be taken at whatever value has been agreed between the parties. But then when the parties have agreed to a slump price for the undertaking as a whole, how will adjustments be made for individual assets? That's a gray area. One does not know the answer to that. So one has to see. If it is a DCF based formula, then you will be replacing the actual consideration, the negotiated price, by the DCF formula. Now, when it is a within group restructuring, it's not a negotiated price. Often it is the book value. In that case, the book value which has been agreed as the transaction price will be replaced. I'm not sure that is required because in a within group transaction, one is not earning a profit. One is only creating a structure which will be monetized in the years to come. As and when it is monetized, a taxable profit will arise and tax will be paid. Today, it has not yet been monetized, and therefore, if today it is charged based on an estimated fair market value, it may result in companies, trades, and industry having to pay tax ahead of the monetization. And I don't see how you can pay tax ahead of monetization because where is the cash flow? Again, one may not be intending to monetize 100%. You may put it together in a separate structure, in a separate SPV, in a separate subsidiary, only with the idea that you will monetize maybe 10, 20, 26%, 49%, 51%, depends on the nature of the business. You will only monetize a part while keeping the rest with the group. If only that part were charged to tax, that's fine. But if you have to pay tax on 100%, while only a part is monetized, that's going to be very much more difficult to do. So one has to see how this amendment really works, how the rules come in, and whether the rules allow you to stagger the monet and pay tax as and when you monetize rather than upfront, just because you are building up a structure for future monetization. If it is an upfront tax, I think it will significantly impact the investment climate and the way in which structuring is done. The next major subject where the change has come in is depreciation on goodwill. Now, this was again an amendment which came in the finance bill. The finance bill, through the explanatory memorandum, has at great length explained how this depreciation on goodwill is, according to the draftsmen, according to the people who have framed the law, unjustified. And consequently, they have said that going forward, depreciation would not be allowed on goodwill. It was being allowed based on a Supreme Court decision in Smith Securities case right from 2011 onwards. It's only now that the law is being changed. Now, when they made the provisions in the finance bill and said that depreciation would not be allowed, the consequential amendment which was required to recompute the block of assets was not made. That was left out. The amendment in section 43(6) was left out to be done. That has now been done in the Finance Act. You have an amendment which tells you that how to recompute 43(6) and how the block of assets will now be computed. Basically, what it says is you work out the WDV of goodwill included in the block as if that was the only asset. For example, if the goodwill was added in 2015, then calculate from 2015 onwards what its WDV would be if this goodwill was the only asset in the block. And once you can do that, you reduce that WDV from the opening block of assets as on 1st April 2020. Again, this is retrospective, going back to 2020. In the calculation of advance tax, in the calculation of every other tax for the whole year, companies thought that they would get depreciation on this goodwill just as they got up to 2019, up to March 20. They have claimed that and they were entitled and they will get it. Whatever be that WDV as on March 20 notionally computed, you reduce that from the block of assets. If it is more than the value of the block, remaining block, you bring it to nil. It may be more because a part of the goodwill may have been sold. So if you had originally put 100 into the block and there was a sale whereby 40 was credited, what is now left is 60 and 60 is further left depreciated. You have to calculate the notional WDV by depreciating 100. That notional WDV has to be subtracted from the block. It may be more than what is now left in the block. In that case, you bring the block to 0. But that is the calculation to be made on a notional basis, and that notional basis reduces the opening WDV and therefore reduces the depreciation for the financial year 2021. Now, what are the issues which are going to arise from this? One of the key questions is goodwill is made up of many things. It's just a name which we have given to a variety of things which are included. It is not really one item. For example, the number of intangible assets which can be included in goodwill include all these: business claims, business information, records, software, contracts, customer base, customer loyalty, distribution network, domain name, brand name, and so on and so forth. So all these in the past, in some case or the other, have been accepted to be intangible assets, and a majority of these have been considered eligible for depreciation. If goodwill really is a composite name which one gives for a large number of these. Some companies may consider the brand separate and the goodwill separate. Some companies may consider the customer base separate and the goodwill separate. Some companies may not do that and may put everything into goodwill. Under Ind AS, there was a requirement that each asset is separately identified. That was not the requirement, and that is not the requirement under the traditional GAAP. So companies go by convenience. Even under Ind AS, not each small asset is separately identified. It is not really necessary, and a lot of them are put together in one asset called goodwill. If the law is now being amended, companies will be inclined to go back and divide and subdivide the goodwill into all these elements which we just spoke of. And then to say that I'm not claiming depreciation on goodwill, I'm claiming depreciation on the trademark. I'm claiming depreciation on the customer base. I'm claiming depreciation on the know-how. I am not claiming depreciation on goodwill. And that is eligible. All other intangible assets continue to remain eligible because Section 32 is not amended. The definition of intangible assets is not amended. They include the specified intangible assets like copyrights, trademarks, know-how, etc. 6 of them, licenses, and after those specified intangible assets, they include any other business or commercial right of a similar nature. So all of these are included. Now, once these are identified, can one claim depreciation on them? The answer seems to be yes. Delhi High Court in Areva T&D, for example, Delhi High Court in Bharti, Delhi High Court the Supreme Court itself had in various other cases allowed such division. So therefore, one should be eligible to make this claim. A question may arise. Why was it, for example, claimed as goodwill from say 2015 onwards? And why did you not claim it separately? Why did you not even from that day itself identify each asset? And I think the simple answer could be that it was unnecessary. The rate of depreciation was the same. Whether you called it goodwill or whether you call it customer base, you would get the same depreciation and the same results. That being the position, it being unnecessary, this was not done. This is now being done because now goodwill part of it, the small component which is not identifiable to any particular intangible asset, only that is ineligible. The rest is eligible. And because the rest is eligible, the different assets have now been identified and claim is being made on those assets. Will it require a rewriting of the books? It's a gray area, but one could possibly argue that books and income tax don't have to be in line. Supreme Court has accepted that from Kedarnath Jute and other cases that the two don't have to be in line. In fact, in the context of intangible assets, the two are never in line. Intangible assets are depreciated in income tax at 25% on WDV. No company depreciates its intangible assets at that faster pace. So in the books, they are depreciated at a lower rate. They may be depreciated on straight line. So the book depreciation and the income tax depreciation are bound to be different. They are different. The result is the WDV in the books and in the income tax is different. Now, if the two are different, in any case, the two numbers don't tally. The description does not have to tally. Therefore, it is not necessary that the books are rewritten. It is sufficient that for purposes of income tax, each component of goodwill, which is an intangible asset in its own right, is identified. And if that is done, possibly depreciation will be claimed on them. Will it be allowed? This is certainly going to mean some degree of litigation, going right up to the Supreme Court and maybe 4, 5, or maybe even 10 years from today, we will know whether it is allowable or not. But I expect India Inc. to make this attempt. I expect that all companies will try. Time will tell whether they are right or wrong. I think they have a justifiable case to do so. Then the point is, to some extent, would you say that the explanatory memorandum has accepted what Smith Securities said in respect of goodwill? And the Supreme Court said it is other business or commercial right and therefore eligible. If that is true, and that part of Smith Securities' decision has been referred to in the explanatory memorandum, but not deviated from, it can't, in a sense. It is not government's this to say that the Supreme Court is incorrect. All that they can do is amend the law. They are amending the law. But they are amending the law to an extent prospectively, except for 1 year, 2021, retrospectively. So that is fine. But therefore, Smiths can be brought into play to apply it to all the other intangible assets. And the logic of Smiths would equally apply to all the other intangible assets as it was applicable to goodwill. And just as an oddity, I may mention to, for the sake of mentioning it makes no difference. As I said at the beginning, what one has to do is to calculate the WDV of goodwill as if it is an asset by itself. So 2015, what was added minus depreciation, which you would otherwise have allowed up to 2020, and that the opening WDV is to be reduced. Madam, now what is happening is the law, as they have now drafted, says reduce even the depreciation claimed under the 1922 Act. But goodwill depreciation was allowed only from 2011. Intangibles were never depreciable till then. So where is the question of setting off the depreciation which could have been claimed under the 1922 Act? Or it says all the years under the 1961 Act. A similar mistake had occurred in relation to software, where the retrospective amendment said it will go back to 1476. And the Supreme Court in the recent decision, Engineering Analysis Center of Excellence, the decision which is rendered about 15 days or a month back, 15 days, has clearly made observations saying it is equally ludicrous for the aforesaid amendment, which also inserted explanation 6 to section 916, to apply from 76 when the technology relating to satellite, optic fiber, etc. came in from the Act of 1995. Why go back to 76? They are saying it's ludicrous. A similar ludicrousy is applying here also. Then coming to the next amendment in section 55 in the context of goodwill. Just 1 second. So, Abhitan, will you take over and put up the slides? Because
yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah. So the similar amendment to section 55, what it says is, if goodwill is 50B, I'm sorry, in the context of sale of an undertaking, what it says is if goodwill is acquired by purchase, then the cost of that goodwill will be included in the net worth of the undertaking. But if the goodwill is acquired by any other means, other than purchase from the previous owner, then the value of that goodwill will not be included in the computation of the net worth of the undertaking. Therefore, it will not form part of cost. Therefore, the profit on the sale of the undertaking will be that much higher. Now, that is clearly a problem. Goodwill is acquired not necessarily only by purchase. It is acquired very often. In the Smith's case, for example, it was acquired in a merger, in an amalgamation. So you acquire goodwill in amalgamation, you acquire goodwill in a demerger, you acquire goodwill in a barter transaction or in a slump exchange transaction. Now, whether slump exchange is equivalent to slump purchase is a question mark. It is not. That is why it was not taxable. That is why the law had to be amended to say that slump exchange will be made taxable. Naturally, it will create a problem now in the context of net worth of undertaking, because to the extent undertakings were acquired by slump exchange, the goodwill will not be considered to be acquired by purchase. It may have been acquired when a firm was converted into a company. Again, you would have paid for the whole. So all sorts of situations where goodwill would be acquired by transactions which may not be considered to be purchase. If they are held not to be purchase, then one will not be entitled to treat the cost of that goodwill as being part of the net worth. So that is one difficulty. The second difficulty which will arise is when one talks of purchase of goodwill as being a necessary condition. The question is, when I purchase an undertaking, when I purchase a business, a goodwill is a part of it. Can you say I have purchased the goodwill? Or would you say that it has to be a separate purchase only of goodwill? Or a purchase of the undertaking, but a price has to be identified and applied to the goodwill. If you don't apply a price to the goodwill, you pay a price for the business as a whole, and then the purchaser does what is called a purchase price allocation. Then what happens? Do you still get the benefit? That's the question which one has to examine. There are decisions which are distinguished between itemized sale and slump sale of the business as a whole, where it is not itemized. In those cases, like Aravinda Reddy and Dhampur Sugar, the Supreme Court has said that even though one may use the word exchange, in substance it is a purchase. So one has to look at those cases. One has to look at the bifurcation between undertaking and goodwill separately. These are issues which are going to arise in the future. I think the best way would have been to distinguish and specify that cases where the transaction by which goodwill was acquired were transactions which are exempt under the Income Tax Act, like merger and demerger. In those cases, goodwill will not be considered to be part of cost because cost is not incurred. In other cases, the cost is allowable, where the transaction was taxable. I think that would perhaps be the best way to take it forward. Go on.
Sir, you'll have to stop your share screen. It is showing double. It's fine, sir.
I'm trying to find how to do that.
No, sir, it's appropriate. We can continue.
Okay, go to the next. I've discussed this, and only to clarify that even if you do an itemized sale or purchase of an undertaking, I don't think it will create a problem for GST. So just to clarify that, I believe the GST exemption will still be available. Go on.
What you do is you look here and speak.
Yeah. Then coming to partnerships, the next major change, as I said, there were three changes: slump sale, goodwill, and partnership. These three are major. As far as partnership is concerned, the entire law was sought to be amended by introducing two new sections, 45(4) and 45(4)(a). Now the amendment introduces, in place of 45(4) and 4(a), a new section 9(b) and a new 45(4), not the 45(4) which was proposed, but a new 45(4). The Sorry, I'm not able to stop my screen share. I think it's okay for participants. Are they able to see?
गौतम सर, अभिजीत मेहता सर को दिया है मैंने, अभिजीत सर को
हाँ,
पीपीटी से।
तो आ रहा है ना सबके लिए?
ओवरलैप हो रहा है,
सर।
आधा पीपीटी नहीं दिख रहा है।
ओके
सर जो इनका गौतम सर का स्क्रीन दिख रहा है उसको मिनिमाइज कर दीजिए ना सर, या और रेड कलर का एरो है उस पर क्लिक करेंगे तो पीपीटी अंदर चला जाएगा सर।
मैंने वेबकैम में बंद कर दिया. The screen is now visible. I will come back only at the end. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, so prior to FA, earlier also we had a 45(4). That 45(4) applied only in the case of dissolution or otherwise, and courts had held that otherwise includes a case of retirement, etc. But it applied to the firm giving away an asset to the partner. So let us say the firm had a plot of land, and that plot of land was transferred to the partner. That was then taxed under 45(4) if the plot of land was held as a capital asset. If it was held as stock in trade, then 45(4) did not apply. If it was held as capital asset, the section applied, and one had to pay tax on the capital asset which was then transferred. The change now is that is in two parts. The Act now takes into account the fact that in a transaction of dissolution, reconstitution, retirement, admission, there could be two people who could be taxed. The firm itself can be taxed, and the partner can also be taxed. Earlier, the firm was taxed, but it was taxed on what the partner received on distribution by way of at the time of dissolution. That is what was being taxed. Now you are trying to tax both the firm and the partner. Is it really necessary to tax the partner? I would think no. I would think ultimately the assets are held by the firm. If and when they are transferred, they are taxed in the hands of the firm. Even if the partner receives it, they are taxed in the hands of the firm. So the firm ultimately pays tax whenever those assets are disposed of. And profit can only arise from a disposal of assets which are taken and disposed. There is no real need to tax the partner at the same time. What happens? The only thing which happens is a partner may get the money today because of an inter se adjustment between the partners. He may be paid off, he may make a profit. The firm will actually realize that money maybe 2, 3, 5 years hence when it actually sells the asset. But one day or the other it will realize, and one day or the other tax will be paid. Now, all that which we are trying to do is tax the partner today and tax the firm also if they transfer the asset. So tax both the firm and the partner today, and then give a set off to the firm of the tax which you have charged on the so-called receipt by the partner today, so that ultimately you tax it only once. So that is the attempt is being made to prepone the tax. I'm not sure it is required. There is no real reason to prepone because the real profit is not earned till the asset is disposed of. So that preponing which is being done is a question mark as to whether it is really justified. But that is what the new scheme is trying to do. So the new scheme has two sections. 9B, which is equivalent to the earlier section, which says that at a time when the asset is withdrawn or the asset is received by the partner, the firm should be taxed. So that is the same. The only difference is it uses the word receipt by the partner versus distribution on dissolution. Does not really change things much. It's only a new word. It narrows the taxation, so that's fine. It applies to both the receipt by the partner of a capital asset, which was the earlier position, 45.4, but even receipt of stock in trade. And I'll deal with that separately. Go on. Then the question is now coming back to the second part of it, the 45.4 part of it. The 45.4 part of it charges what the partner receives in excess of his capital account. And I have given an illustration to try and explain this, and I'll come to that in a minute as to how this is to be computed. So what the partner receives, if his capital account is 1 lakh, but he receives assets worth 10 lakhs, because the assets of the firm have appreciated and he is retiring, and naturally on retirement he will get the real value of the firm, not what is lying in his capital account. So he gets assets worth 10 lakhs. Then you charge on that extra 9 lakhs also today. So you charge on the transfer of the asset to the firm, which results in the partner getting 10 lakhs. And you charge also on the fact that you have transferred money or asset to the partner and the partner gets 9 lakhs extra. You charge twice today, once under 9B, once under 45.4. And what you charge under 45.4, you will get a set off in the future when that asset is sold. That's all that you have done. So that is the position. So, however, as far as 45.4 is concerned, it does not apply to the withdrawal of stock in trade, luckily. It only applies to capital assets and money. And the capital balance which you are supposed to consider for this purpose is not the balance in the capital account, but the balance adjusted for any revaluation or any entry for goodwill, etc. Those are to be excluded. The reduced balance alone is to be considered. So when I say 10 lakhs minus 1 lakh, that 1 lakh is the reduced balance. Go on. Then I have already explained that you will get a future set off. 48.3 is meant for that. This was introduced in the finance bill. It says that the method is going to be prescribed. We have to wait for the actual prescription to understand what 48.3 really means. This section applies at the time of reconstitution. Reconstitution is now defined to mean retire, because there was question. The word reconstitution was used in the finance bill, but one didn't know what reconstitution meant. Now the amendment clarifies that it means retirement of a partner, one or more, admission of one or more new partners so long as one old partner continues, or a change in the profit sharing ratios of partners. All these three cases are cases of reconstitution. We will deal with them a little further. And there is a power in the section to the CBDT to issue guidelines. So in case we are not able to understand, hopefully the CBDT will give guidelines to remove difficulties. Go on. So now taking an example to try and explain, but this is only a simplified example, one dimension. I can think of at least 10 different dimensions which have to be covered, and I would have to take 10 different examples, and I would not, one session alone would not be enough to explain all the permutations, combinations of tax on reconstitution of partnership firms or dissolution of partnership firms. But this is only to bring home a slight home the change. So I've used one simplified example. Let's assume that there is a firm with three partners, A, B, C. A is 40%, B is 60%, and C is a nominal partner with a 0.2%. Land is the only asset which the firm has got. It was originally the partners that contributed 4 lakhs. That 4 lakhs is invested in the land. The present value of that land is 20 lakhs. So it has appreciated a lot. And A is now retiring. The firm is not dissolved because it continues between B and C. A is going to take his value. So what is his value? And that's in the next slide. What is A's value? His value is 7.5 because he is entitled to 20, which is the appreciated value of the land, less the tax which the firm would have to pay if the land were sold, and then 40% of that. So that works out to 7.5. And we are saying that that 7.5 is given to him in two assets. The money, 3.5, and 4 crores worth of land. So 7.5 crores represents 40% of his interest in the firm, interest being calculated net of tax. He is taking it in two forms. The firm does not have cash, so partner B brings in cash of 3.5 crores so that the firm can now pay him 3.5 crores in cash and 4 crores by giving him a part of the land. He takes that. His balance in the capital account is 1.5 crores. That is his original introduction in the firm. So 6 crores is what he's getting extra. This represents what he's getting for the appreciation in the land. Now, tax is payable by this by the firm. He gets the 7.5, he gets the benefit, he gets the 6 crores extra. He does not pay tax because the courts have consistently held that when a partner receives extra on retirement or dissolution, the partner is not taxable. So he does not pay tax on this 6 crores. That part of the law continues. But we are now saying the firm will pay tax on this 6 crores. And the firm will pay tax as if it is capital gain. So there is a formula prescribed in the Act. A, which is the taxable amount, is B plus C minus D. B is the money received by the partner. C is the assets received by the partner minus D, which is the amount in his capital account. The drafting is a little bad. I'll come to that later. But this is what it says. Now, besides taxing the firm on what the partner receives, the firm is also taxed on the same 4 crores of land because it is transferring an asset. So that transfer is also charged under 9B. 4 crores worth of land is being transferred. The cost of acquisition of that land was only 0.8. So there is a long-term capital gain of 3.2 on this land. Now this is an actual transfer of land. So we know that it is long-term. So it is taxed at 20%. Go on. Now, in the future, if and when this land is sold, the balance land of 16 crores is sold, that 6 crores on which the firm was charged, that will be added to the cost. The firm will get a set off and it will pay tax on the reduced long-term capital gain. So 16 crore will be the value of that land. 3.2 is its actual cost. 6 crores extra deduction The remainder is the capital gain 6.8, and that being again long-term capital gain will be taxed at 20%. So what is the difference? One is the tax in 45(4) on that 6 crores. What is the rate? Whether it is 30 or 20, we will discuss that in a minute. Assuming it is 30, you are paying 0.6 extra on that. In short, you are paying 10% extra on the gain attributable to what the partner gets over and above his capital account. And the second difference is the preponement of tax, the fact that you pay tax on the part which the partner got when he retired, whereas this subsequent sale, maybe even 5 years later. That is the difference. In the old law, you would have paid tax only after 5 years. Today, the firm has paid tax in the 5 years back when the partner retired. These are the two major changes. Go on. Now, what are the issues which arise? We have a number of issues arising from that 45(4), I'll come to that, and a number of issues arising from stock in trade. 9B, which we discussed a few minutes back, which applies to the firm for the transfer of the asset. As I said, in the past, only capital assets used to be charged. Now even stock in trade is to be charged. So what it says is capital asset is to be charged as capital gain and stock in trade is to be charged as business income. That is now standard. Naturally, it has to say that. The question is, what business is going to be charged with the transfer of this stock which you have given to the partner? So in the example which we gave, assuming that land, 20 crores worth of land, consisted of 12 crores of capital asset and 8 crores of stock in trade, and you gave him that 4 crores out of stock in trade component, not out of the capital asset component, then 4 crores is taxable as business income, not as capital gain. We computed capital gain, it would be taxable as business income. That's what 9B says. So that's fine. The question which I'm raising is, what is the cost of that stock in trade? In the books, there is a cost. Is that cost relevant? Is that business? That business has not sold this stock in trade. This 4 crores is not a trading transaction. It's a partner withdrawing from the firm. He is taking back from the firm. In the past, the Supreme Court has categorically held in Kikabai Premchand that such a withdrawal is not taxable. All that happens is the cost is only to be adjusted. So in the past, it would not have been taxable. Now 9B says it is to be taxed. Now, why did Kikabai Premchand say it is not taxable? Kikabai Premchand said it is not taxable because it is not a trading transaction. If it is not a trading transaction, it can't enter the normal business income. So will you make a separate computation of business income arising only from this one transaction? If so, what is the cost attributable? Then you have a number of Supreme Court decisions which say that if it is a separate business and there is no identifiable cost, then the cost is the fair value on the day on which the stock in trade entered the business. If that view is taken, if you take the cost to be the value on the day on which the stock in trade entered the business, then there is no profit. The fair value is 4 crores, what you get is 4 crores. That is the consideration, then there is no profit at all. So in these decisions, the Supreme Court had taken that view. If this view is taken, this new section 9B, insofar as it applies to stock in trade, will become a dead letter, will have no impact at all. The second part of 9B2 is it talks of this income arising from the transfer of the capital asset or the stock in trade being chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or profession or under the head capital gain. they are saying that this income will be chargeable. Now, if one has suffered a loss, does it mean the loss will be allowed? Or only the income will be chargeable? One doesn't know the answer. I'm only raising the question. I would not know the answer. Go on. The power to issue guidelines, I don't think we need to spend much time on that. All that one is saying is perhaps there was enough power under the Act. Even today, this power was unnecessary, but it is there. Go on. Then coming to reconstitution. All that one needs to know is it covers, it has said, 3 situations we have said: admission, retirement, change of profit share. What are the scenarios not covered? There can be various other types of situations. Let us say one partner introduces capital, another partner withdraws it, but there is no change in the share of profit. Will that be reconstitution? Answer is no. The partner withdrawing may take more than his capital. He may have a debit balance. There is no change, no admission or retirement. He has a debit balance. He's already got the money. He will not be taxable because it is not covered by the word reconstitution. Let us say there is a change to say that so far certain rights were given to partner A. He alone could decide whether to sell or not to sell, or the price at which the firm was to sell. Now those rights are given to partner B and taken away from partner A. Effectively, you have changed the business, you have changed the managing partner. But that is not a reconstitution because there is no change in share. Then again, change in share. What if the profit sharing ratio remains the same? The loss ratio changes. So profit is being shared 40, 40, 20 between 3 partners. Loss was 33, 33, 33. Hereafter, partner C will not take the loss. A and B will share 50, 50. Is that a reconstitution? One doesn't know. The profit sharing ratio remains the same. Is that a change? Change in remuneration terms. The profit remains same. Partner A was not entitled to a salary. Now he will get a salary. Is that a change of share? Is that a reconstitution? Again, one doesn't know. So all these questions are going to be raised about reconstitution. Then go on. Then the transfer of the asset which is charged under 45(4) and under 9(b) has to be in connection with the reconstitution. So what happens if a new partner comes in year 1, but money is introduced in year 2, or money is introduced in year 1, but retirement happens in year 2 or year 3? There is a gap between the two. Would you say it is in connection with the reconstitution? Now the point is, if the money had not been brought in, there was no way the retiring partner could have taken it out. So in one sense, it is linked to the reconstitution. It is linked to the fact that the new partner brought money in year 1. In one sense, it is not linked to it. The money came in year 1. Admission happened in year 1. There was no withdrawal, so 9(b) and 4 didn't apply in year 1. In year 3, when there is a withdrawal, when there is a retirement and withdrawal, there is no reconstitution in that sense. Or if there is withdrawal without retirement, there is no reconstitution. So can you avoid? These are going to be tax planning devices which people will look at. How they will apply, how GAR will apply, one doesn't know. Then reconstitution assumes that money comes via the partnership to the partner. Then 45(4) applies. What if partner A directly pays partner B and it does not come via the firm? A does not give it to the firm and the firm gives it to B. A gives the payment direct to B. It may be by debit credit to the capital accounts of A and B. Then Anik Industries, Mumbai Tribunal says you will not tax it. That's not a taxable transaction. Is there a transfer by the partner who is giving up his profit share and getting money? Anik says no, because they say he is not giving up his interest in the properties and assets of the firm, but he's giving up his share. He's becoming from 30% 20%. Would you therefore not say there is extinguishment relinquishment? Assuming you say that, what is the cost of that 10%? The cost is not identifiable. Supreme Court has said in Sunil Siddharth that cost of the right to enter into a partnership is not identifiable and the amount in the capital account does not represent the cost. So if the cost is not known, it cannot be charged. So perhaps in future, reconstitutions will be direct between partner A and B. They will not go via the firm. Partner A, if he is to come in as a new partner, will buy the right from partner B. A will then pay B and B will retire, A will be admitted, the firm will not pay B. And because the firm is not paying B, 45(4) will not apply. 9B in any case will not apply because it only applies to a transfer of capital asset and stock in trade. So you would avoid that. The other issues which will go on, number of other issues which will arise. Then one of the key questions is in 45(4), we are saying it will be taxed as capital gain. Namely, if the partner gets, in the example which we gave, 7.5 crores for capital account of 1.5 crores, 6 crores is taxable. The question which arises is taxable as what? Long term, short term? Which asset is transferred? No asset is transferred. You are saying it will be taxed as capital gain. That's what the section is saying. But it does not say whether it will be taxed as long term or short term. It does not specify that. Can there be capital gains which is neither long nor short? Can such capital gains be charged at all? Or does the machinery break down? If the machinery breaks down, do you go back to Srinivas Shetty and say if the machinery breaks down, the act cannot apply, the section cannot apply? What do you do if the firm has got long-term, brought forward long-term loss or brought forward short-term loss? Can you set it off? No answers. These are questions which, given the fact that they have the right to issue guidelines, hopefully the guidelines will clarify. Which way they will clarify, one doesn't know. Then one possible interpretation is that the charge itself is missing. This withdrawal is deemed to be chargeable under the head capital gains. It is not, the deeming fiction says it does not deem that to be a capital gain. It's a highly technical point, but the fact remains the deeming fiction language may not be accurate. One may just leave it at that. Then in the drafting, while in the initial part of the section they talk of capital asset and or money being received by the partner, in the latter part they have only referred to money. The word capital asset is missing. It's a mistake. I'm sure it will be included. Go on. Then in the reconstitution, other issues are, you see, under 9B, you are charged, or 45(4), you are charged on the profits and gains, and you are told how the profits and gains will be computed. That formula I told you, A is equal to B plus C minus D. The formula is for the computation of the profit, for determining how much profit to charge. But the charge will apply only if you have made a profit. Now, if you have not made a profit, then the question of computing will not arise. So the formula should not apply. In KP Varghese, when 52(2) was amended, the Supreme Court took the view that first the department has to show that you have received some black money. And then when some black money is received, the computation will be by the formula laid out in 52.2. But that trigger has to be first shown. In this case also the trigger has to be first shown. If that view is taken, and then you go back to the earlier Supreme Court decisions in Adanki Narayanappa or Malabar Fisheries, you will come to the conclusion that there is no profit. A firm cannot make profit from trading with its own partner. It does not make profit that way when partners are admitted and retired. So if there is no profit or gain, the question does not arise. So will 45.4 also be a dead letter? One does not know. Then we are saying in the capital account computation, you will not include revaluation, you will not include self-generated goodwill, you will not include other self-generated assets. What if the firm has put profits into a reserve account? Will that be included? Will that not be included? What if the partner's capital account is a debit balance and that is forgone? You are not giving him anything at all. No money is given, no asset is given. All that you are saying is you have to pay 10 crores to the firm, don't pay. What will happen? Go on. So we have dealt with revaluation and similar other questions. The next question which arises is all these questions answer the firm's taxation. What will happen when the partner sells this asset in the future? What is the cost to him? If he has received stock in trade, what is the cost to him? I would think he will be entitled to claim that the fair market value on the date of retirement, on the date of dissolution is the cost to him, following Lakshmi Jain, Shirinbai Kuka. But again, grey areas, no clarification in the Act may come in the guidelines. Go on. So these were the three key amendments which one were concerned with. The smaller amendments in the Finance Act, one is dealing with the liable to tax. Liable to tax is a definition which is being introduced with the idea of trying to make sure that assessees cannot, A, avoid being deemed to be resident without really being liable to tax in a foreign country. Because under section 6(1)(a), they would be deemed to be resident in India if they are not liable to tax in any other country by virtue of their domicile or residence in that country. So 6(1)(a) now creates a deemed residency, saying if you are an Indian citizen and if throughout the year you travel all over the world in such a way that you are not resident of any country, you are not domiciled in any country, and therefore you don't pay tax in any country, you cannot avoid tax in India by saying you are non-resident. We will treat you as a resident. Of course, it applies only to those people who have more than 15 lakhs of taxable income in India. And in such a case, they are still considered to be resident but not ordinarily resident. So they only pay tax on Indian income. Indian income in any case they would have paid, even as non-residents. So nothing much is achieved by 6(1)(a). But this is what 6(1)(a) says. Now 6(1)(a) depends upon are you liable to tax in a foreign country. So to get over that problem of what is liable to tax, a definition has now been introduced in the Act. It was introduced in the Finance Bill. That definition is being improved in the Finance Act. So one clarification in the definition is that the test as to whether you are taxed in a foreign country has to be with reference to a specific country. It goes without saying. Earlier also it said any country. Now you have to look up all countries. Second clarification is that it must be a liability to income tax. Only then you are liable to tax. That's also fine. So you are liable to tax if in that country you are liable to tax under the law of that country, even if you are given an exemption in that country. But the language says subsequently exempted. One is not clear what one means by subsequently exempted. Exempted is fine. If the exemption exists on the day on which you become liable, is it subsequently exempted? Because would you not mean that what it means is that under that act, first you are liable and then you are exempt? So that is some, or does it mean that exemption has to be introduced later in the act? Not clear, one has to see that. Then number of other questions on liable to tax will continue. In particular, you may have issues even for assessees who are not taxable in that country, because that country does not have a tax law like Oman, Qatar. Same may apply to Dubai. But Dubai will not apply because the DTA between India and Dubai has slightly different language, does not use the word liable to tax. The DTA between India and Oman or India and Qatar uses the word liable to tax. So you may say they are not liable to tax, therefore they will not be entitled to the benefit of the DTA. It may not really matter because they will still be non-resident, they will not pay tax on their foreign income in India. Go on. So this is one major problem which is being created. And the only other thing I would like to mention is we are talking about taxation in another country by virtue of domicile or residence. There are a number of countries where you can easily become taxable by virtue of residence. In UK alone, you can become taxable by just having a house there for 91 days. It can be a one room in a hotel booked for 91 days and staying for 30 days in a year makes you resident of UK. Assume that you keep a small bank account and pay tax on that on £1,000 in UK, which is below taxable. You don't pay tax in UK, but you are taxable in UK because of your residence, and therefore 618 does not apply to you. You are liable to tax in UK. So that's one type of situation which people may use. The other possibility is it applies to Indian citizens. People will choose to become non-Indian citizens. So these are all issues which time will tell us. The other, go on. The other amendments which we are concerned are small amendments dealing with Provident Fund. 2.5 is increased to 5 lakhs, but a condition is put. There should be no other contribution by the employer and so on. So I think these amendments don't really require our attention. I will leave them. And I think with that, I would thank all of you for having heard me so patiently. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think we all into thought process zone, all silenced, and really we've been absolutely in awe of the way that you put across all of these things, sir. I would request Drushti madam.
Thank you, Gautam bhai, for wonderful analysis and the
Madam, your voice is not proper, Madam. So what we can
think,
do for Madam, we can take up
Manish
a
bhai,
question.
yeah, Manish bhai, I'll take up the questions.
Yeah.
I think Drushti madam is facing some network issue. So once Gautam joins us, within a minute we'll take some questions.
Gautam bhai is joining in 1 minute. You can start.
Madam, good evening, madam. How are you?
Very well. Hello. Gautam is just coming in 1 minute.
Yes, madam. Sure, madam. I think all of us actually are looking to take that small little break so that we can digest, and so many things that has been covered so very within an hour. I think really very, very it has been a fantastic session. So many we've almost covered the entire act in a such a quick manner, in such a brief manner.
He's just come.
Sir,
Questions.
Sure.
sir, if we can take some questions, if you permit, we can take some questions, sir.
Okay. No, I'm okay. Yeah.
Drushti madam is also back. Madam, we are about to take some questions. So the first one, section 45(4). The above
Yeah.
amendment has been proposed in the finance bill. By that, if a firm increases the partner's capital to the extent of his share in the market value of a property belonging to the firm and pays the same, it shall amount to capital gains, and the firm shall have to pay the tax applicable to on as a long-term capital gain. This
Yeah.
is with effect to AY 21-22. Now the questions are, if such a transaction has been affected on August 20, then will it amount to long-term capital gains?
As I have said, there is no clarity. The section does not say whether it is long-term or short-term. So one does not know the answer to this. Perhaps the guidelines will tell us. And my view being that if it does not tell us long-term or short-term, an extreme view one can take, as I mentioned, is section is not applicable, don't pay tax.
Wow. Whether the assessee shall be liable to pay advance tax in this scenario?
He was liable, but naturally he could not have paid because this amendment came on 23rd March. So there are Bombay High Court decisions which say, and other high courts also, which say that in such a case, interest can't be charged. But the
So I
liability
think
to
next all these questions, right? All the other questions then therefore need not be answered because you've summed up with the Bombay High Court decision. So I think. So the next question is, in case of partnership, the tax on valuation in the hands of firm, but if on actual sale the value is depleted, then how the set off will be made where the amount of set off is more than the realization?
no. So on the value point is on the valuation you have taxed. If there is a depletion, there is nothing to tax. If on the transfer, 9B will not apply because the consideration is the fair market value on the date of transfer, less the cost. So there is nothing to tax. But if you have used the asset to pay the partner, it will still be taxed under 45(4) if you have paid the partner more than the balance in his capital account. That part is taxable because you are paying him more, and that you will get in the future as a cost if there are other capital assets. How it will be allowed in the future, rules are to be prescribed, they have not yet come.
Right, sir. For claiming credit of TDS under 48(3) by transfer such asset to one of our close relative at cost in the year of asset received from firm. So can we claim the credit of TDS?
No, but I mean, you will claim credit of TDS in the year in which you are taxable. The partner is not taxable. The firm is taxable.
Right.
So the question of claiming credit of TDS, etc., will not arise in the partner's case. Now, the point which I think what really is are trying to ask is, instead of, no, but he's talking about partner giving to relative. Otherwise, I thought what he really meant was the firm giving to the relative, but that's not the question.
So in the year of asset received from firm, so it has received from the firm, and such an asset has been transferred to a close relative at cost.
But as I said, this section deals with the firm's taxation. It does not clarify what cost the partner will get and how the partner will be taxed. So normal law will apply. If he is selling to his relative, he will pay capital gains or business income. If he is giving a gift to his close relative, he will not pay anything. There is no tax paid by him. There is no TDS due to him. Tax is all paid by the firm. So there is no question of getting anything back because of this transfer to the relative. Yeah. Then your next question was, can the firm give any?
Drushtiben, please. I believe Arpit is some network issue is there.
Yeah.
Can the
Even
firm
you-
give any? Yes. So the next question, Gautam bhai, is can the firm give any asset to the partner on reconstitution, which is neither money or capital asset or SIT? Whether the term money under section 45(4) will include debtors, loans, advances, etc. What if debtors are given to the partner?
It's a gray area. As I have mentioned, number of gray areas. This is one more. If you say it's none of the three, and it is none of the three. If the debtor is not a capital asset, then it is none of the three. The better view is all debtors, all loans and advances are capital assets of the firm. And if you treat them as capital assets, then what you give will be deemed to be a capital asset and 45(4) will be applied on that basis. So I can't think of an asset which is not one of the three. Money, capital asset and stock in trade. It covers everything.
Right. Okay. So if two partners existing by share of the retiring partner in a partnership firm and pays to the retiring partner by debiting their partner's capital and crediting retiring partner, then can it be said that the firm has paid to the retiring partner as exiting partners are reducing their capital account and retiring partner's capital account is increased and paying money thereof by partnership firm?
I mean, if the adjustment is made via the capital accounts of the partners, according to me, A is directly paying to B. The firm is only being used like a bank to route the money through the firm, but it is not a payment by the firm. Firm is not using its money to pay to the partner who is retiring, and therefore this problem should not arise. It should not be hit by 45(4). But one would have to see how the actual contract between the partners is drafted and put across. Whether it is a payment by A to B, I would prefer to do it entirely outside the partnership. Then this question would not arise.
Okay. When
Yeah.
one partner resigns and the other partner and another partner is incoming, but firm does not have any immovable property, and partner who resigned was getting the balance that appeared in the capital account, what will be the impact of the amendment?
I mean, if you get only the balance in the capital account, 45(4) will not apply. 9B would apply if some asset is given. If no asset is given, neither capital asset nor stock in trade, even 9B will not apply. And therefore, there will be no consequence. So a simple situation where a partner goes out of a firm by just taking the balance in his capital account, there will be no tax consequence.
Sure, I think that's it from the question side. So there was so many questions on partnership reconstitution. I think it's really still very, very ambiguous, and it will keep on evolving. And I guess, Gautam bhai, you'll be flooded with lots of questions on this. So with this, I think we can.
The profession as a whole is going to be flooded, but yeah.
Right. Okay, so Arpit, may I request you to propose a vote of thanks, a formal vote of thanks, please?
Gautam bhai, before I could give vote of thanks, let me take your time for one more session. Once the rules are prescribed for this partnership taxation, I think we'll have to schedule one more session. And believe me, the kind of coverage that we've done in this 1 hour, really it has been wonderful. And thank you once again. At such a short notice, you've created this series, created this program for us for WIRC. And I think till the time we've joined in, almost 1,000+ people were there. They're still there. That's the biggest feedback that we can get. So thank you, Gautam bhai, and thanks Abhit for helping in this seminar, and thank you for creating this wonderful session. I think it's a full box of lot of knowledge, and must be this I think this video, once uploaded on YouTube, will have a lot of views again, because people will want to again and again listen for their own clarity. Thank you once again, Gautam bhai, and for creating this for WIRC. On behalf of WIRC, we thank you for a wonderful session today. And I wish you a very safe and happy Holi. Bhavna Ben was also there, so even we met her. And I will request now all of us if we can join hands and really thank Gautam Bhai for a wonderful session.
Thank you all.
Thank you and happy Holi to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you and happy Holi.